Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so thrilled today to be joined by the wonderful Emily Beecham to talk all about her latest Netflix series, 1899. And I've heard you mention that this project felt very different to any of the projects that you've done previously as an actor, and as a result, you had to approach it quite differently from any other project as well. And within that, I was really interested in what those differences were, what that shifted and changed for you in terms of not only creating this character, but also in essence going into production and filming, and just how that felt like a different approach for you overall.
Gosh, there's so many parts of it that were really different. For one, and the technology, the volume, which is a new technology, it replaces green screen. But also the way that Bo and Yancha work, and they somehow piece together the thing-ish as they go along, but they know the overall arc really, but they did warn us that it might take a U-turn and we might have to reshoot stuff and they'll rewrite the plot. But that actually didn't happen in the end. But also because of Moira, my character, she's suffering memory loss, which is obvious from the trailer. She's talking to herself like a bit like Memento, or she's reminding herself who she is. So she's got these massive gaps and then kind of these flashbacks of traumas, but also she's so many different things, and she keeps getting clues as to who she is. She's a bit like an onion, so you pull it off and then something else is underneath there. And she's a totally different person to who she or we thought she was, which is exciting, but also it kind of meant, because she can't remember who she is, she's keeping all her cards close to her chest. So as you would really not know who to trust. And so I watched, I think it's Still Alice, and with Alzheimer's references, and also Manchurian Candidate and Memento, which is also about not really trusting your surroundings, not knowing who you are. So I think beforehand it was about kind of making choices as to how to make the character without making her just, dull or too closed or too vulnerable, wanting her to have different things that come out all the time. So she has a lot of contradictions. She's very strong-minded and assertive and clever, but also she is a victim, and she is vulnerable because of her circumstance for many reasons. And she's a woman in 1899 as well. She's trying to practice as a doctor. She's not allowed to. Loads of different things that are kind of crippling her along the way, but she's sort of pushing through that. So it was a bit like a mind map, and then another clue in the plot comes that shifts her and takes a total U-turn. So it was kind of going, okay, what's that mean? What's that marker? And figuring out when to harass Bo and Yancha, the writers, the creators, about what's that mean? Is that significant? Do you know yet what this is? Tell me. So it was unusual. It was like playing several different characters at once with a lot of secrets kept hidden from you, but some not anyway.
And given the number of different directions that this character is taking you, and the number of different facets that you're even just describing there, and in particular, it sounds like maybe you didn't have all of the scripts up front, or that you knew that they might potentially rewrite certain arcs. Did you have to go into scenes kind of making choices that in essence would give you the ability and give you the space to make those U-turns and make those potential shifts when you're filming a scene a couple of episodes later?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I had to, I guess, make it all make sense or be quite specific. I kind of wanted it to be quite specific, and that sounds quite boring, but because I think it makes it more interesting or more kind of nuanced or layered if you do put in the effort to think about what's the specificity, or what is she, what's her angle right now, or what are her secrets, what are her idiosyncrasies, or whatever. What was your question? I think I've gotten myself into a labyrinth.
No, I feel like in 10 you are answering it though, because it's about that kind of necessity potentially to make choices where you can shift and change, but it sounds like kind of being quite specific was the answer to that.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that as well. Yeah, keeping an open mind. And I think it wasn't until episode, I don't know, 6 or 7 that Bo was like, oh, is that, I've watched it, it works, you care about her. Or, because before we started, he was like, I don't know who Moira is. I was like, okay, great. Nobody, but in a way that is it. It's figuring out who she is along the journey, and she is this sort of as I said, contradictions and surprises. But I think that is true to everyone. That's quite realistic. I think we're full of many different polar opposites all the time. Just what we choose to show on the outside, really, or what our choices are. But really, we're, as human beings, we're a million and one different things, really. I mean, there was sorts of in our nature. So I thought it was an interesting opportunity and with the character.
Did you talk with them at all about moments where you wanted to draw the audience into certain details, or to allow them to see certain aspects within her, against where things needed to be kept quite close to the chest as well, narratively? Because even just thinking back to the beginning of the first episode, when she wakes up from a dream, and in her dream she's been restrained, but then when she wakes up, there's that moment where you're kind of touching your wrists and we see the marks on them. And so that's an instance of making sure that the audience kind of has that detail. And then I imagine that as you go further into the season, that there's almost things that make sense in regard to earlier moments a lot.
Yes. Well, they're spinning so many plates at once, and there's so many things that they're in charge of with the, filming it and all the details. They know a million and one details, and then our job is to make the characters real and as accessible or interesting as possible. And so I think everybody had their different departments, but it's all kind of carefully managed by Yensha and Bo together. It's all here. And also, they also said in the beginning, they said it was quite a delicate process. So sometimes they were like, just, you can't ask questions right now because it's so delicate, and like it influences what we decide later, and we don't want that. So just leave that for now. And so you've got to respect every different way that filmmakers work, which is always different. So adapt to it. But for me, it was finding things that made her accessible, and those references like Still Alice or Manchurian Candidate were useful things to hang on to. And because she's quite lost, she's a bit like a jellyfish. She's like totally lost and vulnerable in the beginning, and then she starts to find more of her autonomy and her control, and starts to find she's a bit like an anti-heroine, so you don't quite know whether she is a good or a bad person, and that's sort of also what she is trying to figure out. Yeah.
And you were bringing up one of the details of her before, which is that she's been studying medicine, which is a field that's not welcoming to women. And even just the fact that she's able to study it, but she's not allowed to practice it within her field. And the fact that it's, the brain is the center of fascination for her. When you have such a key component to a person like that, how did that inform some of her personality aspects? Because that in of itself is telling us about, her confidence, the fact that she doesn't conform to what society thinks she should be as a person. And so what were a lot of the details that something like that so essential gave you in her?
Mm-hmm. Well, she says at one point that her father brought her up to be as a boy, as her son. And so she, in her mind, she's capable of doing, obviously she's very clever. And so she's obviously frustrated by that and wanting to be able to do it, and obviously have her autonomy and make the choices she needs to make, or especially when the other doctor on the ship is ridiculously lazy and useless, and also incredibly patronizing. And so it's trying not to get herself a balance between not getting herself into trouble, which you could do, really. I mean, sometimes many women didn't really have control over their finance or their own lives, really. So you want to be a little bit cautious in that. And I also thought it was interesting. There was an interesting story that I read about a woman who was put in an asylum because I think she didn't conform to the religion that her husband wanted her to be in. So he basically got her locked up. And it was only years later that they confirmed she's not insane. So she was eventually released. But she obviously took all her assets. And anyway, so I think that was a good example as to how vulnerable she could be. So she's only pushing as much as she can. So she's clever and cautious, but yes, yeah. So she is on that ship to travel to the US, so she can practice as a doctor. She couldn't in the UK. Yeah.
And also going back to that detail of memory loss for her, you know, it's interesting to see how she navigates and how she moves through the space, being quite observational, or even just that moment in front of the mirror where she's saying out loud to herself, you know, this is my name, this is where I'm from, this is today's date, I'm not crazy, you know, and almost and starts kind of repeating that cycle again. So we see that this isn't just something that she says once out loud to herself. And so how did you find the different ways in which she tries to read information that she's uncertain of, and also just to really center herself in the face of uncertainty?
That's actually quite a tricky question. I mean, well, because she's saying all those things to herself, you understand that she's kind of having some kind of experience where she's reminding herself, at least she can remember that she needs to get a grip on her reality all the time. She doesn't remember anything else, which is actually quite similar to Memento in many ways. He keeps getting these photographs and going, fuck, okay. Oh. So at least she's got that. She's got this kind of thin string, which is horrible. It's very disconcerting and very vulnerable making. And I mean, that would just probably be your worst scenario, really. And it's sadly, what a lot of people experience with memory loss, and must be awful experience. But yeah, so in a way, she herself is her own worst enemy. And then of course she's having a lot of panic attacks, which is in the script, which is kind of though it was escaping from this thing. She's got these flashbacks and these memories, and she's pushing them away or kind of fighting them. So that's kind of, I think, how it manifests itself, forcing and fighting and pushing against these things, and results in her being incredibly kind of controlled and fearful, is how she starts out. Yeah, she's having a huge battle with herself until she starts to get a bit of a grip as the show goes along and figures out, actually, this is the direction I need to go in, and actually there's this character, I don't know if I can say, or this character. And I think it's great because at the end, actually, I wanted her to shift and be strong, and she gains more control and realizes she's actually a lot more responsible for many things than she realized, or that finds her momentum or her fight or her direction, and has more control. So you do see a different side of her.
Yeah. And what, I love it. And what did you view as her relationship between the fact that she's someone who tries to approach everything from a very logical standpoint, you know, even just the fact that she really understands the brain and how we process information, but also there are emotional components, you know, and there's emotional components to the fact that she's even on this boat to begin with. And she's even complimented at one point about, oh, you're someone that leaves your emotions out of things, but that's not always necessarily true. Sometimes it's just underneath the surface. And so sometimes it comes to the foreground more. And so what did you view that relationship between the fact that ultimately, logically and intellectually, that's how she wants to approach things, but that's not always the case in how she's able to?
No, yes, she's very yes, she's a science head, so she's, you know, into science and fascinated about that, but also she has this loss and things that she's having to deal with, so it's a balance between the two. She's, yes, dealing with both things. I probably want to say a lot more about that, but anyway, I'll go back.
I know you're doing such a great job at giving details and not giving the entire plot of the show away. I'm impressed and appreciate it. Yeah. You know, and also within that sense of not trusting anyone, even herself, there's a real stoicness to the way that you deliver your performance, and a real stillness and a quietness to her. Was that something that was quite evident to you on the page, in the idea of how you saw her movement as a character?
Well, so she's got a massive internal world. because, well, she's holding so many secrets. There's like ticking time bombs. They're quite explosive secrets. And she's also a bit of like a detective. She's almost undercover. I mean, she's hiding really, because she could get into trouble. There's this murky past and she doesn't want to go back to whatever that memory was. And she's escaping something, she doesn't quite know what, and she doesn't know what happened to her brother. She doesn't know if she's in trouble. So she's got shields up all the time. But also there's, as I said, she's her own worst enemy. So there's these things that are coming out that she can't really control. So she's kind of constantly thwarted by this thing that she doesn't know what it is. But yeah, I think I wanted her to come out as the show progresses, trying to do that with having a big internal emotional world, or but also she's clever and quite manipulative in a way, as Bo was mentioning before, and so she's not going to obviously give things away to the other characters. So she's kind of bluffs them and us, and yeah.
I mean, the fact that she is very conscientious of how people are viewing her, she's very aware that people, you know, they're all in an enclosed space on this ship, and so people do gossip and they talk about her and they have ideas and perceptions, and so she is being very conscientious about what she gives away. And even, you know, when there's someone that she's talking to on the ship who is telling her about them losing family on Prometheus, she doesn't say anything in return and admit that she has a personal connection to this either. And so what was that dynamic for you in finding a lot of the scenes with other characters, and kind of essentially making sure that you yourself are also never giving too much away and never giving too much detail?
Yeah, well, she does never knows who knows her father, or it's definitely obvious she doesn't want to be found in some way. So yeah, I think that was between Bo and I, and talking about that, and is it clever for her to be so acerbic right now, or kind of to challenge him so much, or why does she feel compelled to say this to this person, or so yeah, what drives her? Why doesn't she just, otherwise she'd just stay in her room and just hide and not talk to anyone. So yeah, it was always an ongoing discussion, and as I said earlier, it's almost like a chance, really. Sort of have to wait and see, and then see if it works, and see which that's a nerve-wracking way to work, but also that a show like this and people who work in that way, that's how you approach it. So and hope for the best. And they're very clever. I mean, there's things that they're doing, Bo and Yancha, that you're not even aware of, really, and you don't see until the final product, until the post-production is done. And then you see that everything feeds into it, and the entire atmosphere and the entire world and the ocean and what it's doing. And it's a bit like, remind me a bit of, do you know Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry? Well, there's a bit, every time the characters are going through something, the weather kind of, there's a word for it, when the weather complements your what's happening to you. And there's
pathetic fallacy.
Yeah, there's many reasons for that in 1899, which would be spoilery for me to chat about, but it's sort of all, the whole thing, the whole atmosphere, everything just feeds into, I think, also her psychology, her point of view, and her emotional journey and loss and all this sort of stuff. I think water felt very significant of the whole thing. That I don't know, it sounds strange, but the whole loss, or the grief that she was experiencing, and yeah.
Trying not to give it all away.
And
It's also it's quite interesting in watching a character that when there's things which create a lot of questions for the other characters,
Yes.
like that her responses are quite distilled down, because like you're alluding to and like you're saying, she's dealt with that idea of not being certain what truth is and what isn't, so when they find the boy who's locked inside the cabinet, everybody else is really shocked by that, and she doesn't seem that surprised. And did you get a view quite early on that there were going to be instances like that where for everybody else it's a million questions, but for her it doesn't feel as unusual because of everything that she's already been processing?
Yes, well, Mara knows there's a significant reason why there's a ship and why the other ship disappeared, and that her father has a connection to it, and he's a very manipulative, clever, powerful character, and that there is something deeply fucked up about the whole situation, that she knows that there's this connection to it all, but of course she can't say to anyone, because if that got back and then it linked back, then she would be found, and she's trying to escape something, but she doesn't quite know what. So yeah, and also the boy provoked something in her, and there's all sorts of confusions. I mean, you discover about their relationship later on, which is a very significant relationship. And so I think, as I said, I think as I guess Bonyancha, I think we discussed it together, or maybe I talked about that. Of course, what is actually happening informs, which we don't know and she doesn't know, informs what we see happening. So her reactions would be unexpected, as Bo put it to me once. He had kind of a reference of somebody from Blade Runner who reacts really differently. So maybe Mara reacts in a totally opposite way how you think she would react to certain things. So it's stirring up something. It sounds so complicated, but as I said, like an onion. So it's like stirring up something in the subconscious, which is different to the consciousness of what's actually happening. So she's feeling something different, or something provocative or strange than just this creepy boy. There's some other things.
And I did also want to ask you about the technology that you were mentioning earlier. I think it's LED volume, where in essence it's using LED screens instead of green screen, and how that shifted a lot of the experience of making this, because even just the fact that you could change the entire setting and the camera wouldn't have to move, so it changed the dynamic even just between scenes as well. But what was the difference in working with that on a show like this?
If we weren't working with it, that was when COVID was really bad, and there was all sorts of quarantining, lockdowns, all sorts of things. So if we had traveled to all these different destinations, I mean, we would have been, to get to Berlin alone, I had to quarantine for 10 days in Poland, and then before I entered Berlin, and then so it would have been a lot longer and trickier to shoot. And also equally, if we were doing it all on green screen, it was actually, I've never actually really done much green screen work before, so I can't say, but it from what everyone says, it's hard work, because it's for an actor, because it's a green screen. So you're just in a green room. So yeah, it was very useful for us. We were lucky as actors to be able to use it, because we're surrounded by obviously the ocean, which moves, and it does feel like you're a bit seasick. Some people, it feels like you're moving because your surroundings are going like this the entire time. And you could be in Scotland on the moors and just transported into like a big landscape or something else. So you know what you're looking at basically, and it makes you feel different, because they look beautiful to look at. And up close, they're obviously quite pixelated, and on the camera they just look amazing. But I think technically for the crew it was difficult. There were about 20 operators who were operating the machine at once, and then having to angle it round. Occasionally it would black out, but not really often. It was pretty, well, from what I saw, it was pretty great. And then the stage rotated and it would move, and we'd have rain machines and wind machines, and so it was a bit like a virtual reality experience thought maybe this is the future. That's a dark prophecy, but but it reminded me a bit of what is it when on Star Trek, when they go into these virtual holidays, they go into this room and it's a virtual experience and they're like, wow, I'm in Hawaii. But so it was very sensory experience, which was great. You didn't have to pretend there was wind or rain blowing in your face. It just was happening, which was very fun. I like the gimbal. It's a gimbal that moves the set from side to side. That's my favorite thing, because you go, "Wah!" falling on each side. I think they must have used that in Triangle of Sadness. I don't know if you've seen it, all flying from one end of the room to the other.
Yeah. A lot of seasickness on screen on that one.
Yeah, I never got seasick. Some other people did, but really, really enjoyed the gimbal.
Yeah. It's also quite striking in watching the show, because the majority of it is taking place, at dark and quite shadowy spaces, and obviously they're being incredibly specific about what we're seeing in any frame, and so a lot of the frames are quite close up on character as well. And so did you have to be quite specific in terms of that relationship with the camera, and very much knowing where it is, knowing where the light was, knowing what was going to be in frame, or was that kind of outside of what you were having to focus on in scenes?
I don't think so. I think, well, Bo's got a very specific taste for what he likes aesthetically. I think he went to art school, he was a painter, and he's enjoys visuals. And I think dark, and their other movies look really striking visually. I think they're very beautiful and tonally very dark and shadowy, which also does a lot of the work for you. I mean, it does just affect everything when there's shadows suddenly falling down. Makes a big difference to an atmosphere, and so once you see in the after post effects, and because they have a lighter monitor and a darker monitor, so you can actually see things, and the darker one just suddenly looks really rich and atmospheric and gloomy, and but the colors, everything's really beautiful, so we'll get that for free. It just looks a lot of depth to it. Not really. I mean, I guess every show is different. Some want everything this way, or some don't. And I think maybe they appreciate things going into shadow and light. And I like that too. So I like a film or whatnot where everything's a bit not perfect, and you see shadows or movement or people come in and out. It has a more kind of real, for me anyway, I feel like it has a more immediate feel. I like it as a viewer. I like that kind of raw feel of it. So although maybe I should be more conscious of things technically. I think probably the cameraman DOP would agree with that, but nobody ever told me about it. So, well.
And with everything that you've been describing in terms of with this character, all of the different layers and all the different directions, the fact that she's quite unpredictable, she's also responding to things in terms of the conscious and the subconscious. How did you approach just kind of tracking all the elements of that? Because again, you're not filming the entire series specifically in order, scene by scene, I'm sure. And so what was your approach for really just tracking the different trajectories of where she's going when there's so many non-linear threads to a character in a show?
I had to have a chart. I mean, naturally, sometimes I write down the scene order and everything anyway, because you always film out of sequential order. So, you have to go, I'm all the way back here. Oh, yeah. So to jog your memory. But especially for this, I mean, impossible to do it without 8 episodes. It was just like a huge kind of cross-country jog, I think. The little points, and then asking them so kind of all these changes, and then also what Moira has decided, how her perception has shifted because of find ring. Ring appears in pocket, ring is in here. I get a message from so-and-so that tells me this, and then what Moira decides with that, whether she thinks that's true or a bluff or what. and then when that's coming out later, and when she's yielding to so and so, or opening up to so and so, or what her choices are. I mean, it all moves so fast. Sometimes you're like, should I have talked to Yansha about that? I mean, there's never a right or wrong answer. So you, as you say, sometimes you look back and you go, fuck. I mean, but actually, it's sometimes the way it is, or the way it should be. So I think, yeah, it's always kind of a balance of judgment about, yeah, and then letting it go and going, actually, well, this is who the character is. So now, yeah.
I mean, it's so fascinating having to just think about all of
there you
the
go. Moving on. Yeah.
It's definitely a huge volume of gymnastics that you've had to do in terms of this performance and this character, but you know, it's really, really paid off in the episodes I've seen so far. So I can't wait to see the rest to figure out all the backstory and the details, hopefully. But congratulations on the series, and thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate your time today.